Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler podcast, a relatively new series in the sense that this is only the second episode of audio pieces presented on YouTube as well as SoundCloud for ease of access, and you can get this via searching for Watch Chronicler on SoundCloud or just by going to our website where these podcasts are available. But this is an unscripted format and a slightly more informal version to the scripted videos I produce at the end of each week. And this is to address questions and other points which need a more relaxed discussion or debate or explanation. And so today I'd like to speak about watch bezels. Now, a lot has been written about bezels. There are a lot of technical explanations of these things. There are also a lot of more subjective descriptions of what is best in the opinion of the writer. But I'd like to speak very technically about aspects which are rarely discussed, which is to say the inner workings. So that's with regards to the way bezels will click, the way they're held in place, and I will also talk about the materials too, because I think all of these things are important to be aware of and tend to go unnoticed through watch reviews, but also articles generally about these aspects of watches which we use so often during our daily lives. Before I begin, do head over to Instagram to follow Watch Chronicler to get all the latest information about new podcasts, articles, videos, and also general photography, which hopefully you'll enjoy. And do also head over to watchchronicler.com to read a number of articles and pieces which are exclusively available in written form and never appear here on the channel or on SoundCloud, where you might find these podcasts. So do have a look over there for further content and other information. But bezels are one of those things which we use on a near daily basis, certainly amongst watch enthusiasts, because they're a much more practical solution to chronographs and timing devices. Now, of course, chronographs have their place, but with regards to the expense which they incur, and also the fact that a lot of watches which we like, for example dive watches, tend to command a significant premium if you go for a chronograph, direct a lot of us towards bezels, a very elegant and simple solution to measuring time. But not all are created equal in the world of bezels, with different assemblies, different ways in which they're held to the case, and also different ways of making them click. Of course, at base you have the most simple solution to this, if we start with how they're held to the case. Now, most bezels that one sees are held to the case in one of two ways. Either with a spring or a piece of metal which has been bent into facets, which slots into a slot in the case, and thus allowing the bezel to turn, but also allowing it to be popped off, or the alternative, which is a rubber gasket, which is another equivalent of the same thing really. It's essentially locking the bezel in place. Of course, both of these bezel solutions have roughly the same results, in the sense that if you clip the bezel on something, for example you were to knock it against a desk or something else solid, you could pop the bezel off if there was a significant enough lip on the bottom of the bezel to be able to catch, because they're being held on in essence by friction, hence why you can remove them so easily. And the advantages of this is that you can, as I said, remove the bezel relatively easily for cleaning. This isn't advisable, but I mean if the watch is being serviced then it can be cleaned relatively easily, but also these are less expensive at the end of the day than having a more complex attachment between the bezel and the case. Now, of course, there are some chemical aspects to why you might prefer to have a spring as opposed to a rubber O-ring sitting within a sort of a slot and thus holding the bezel to the case, but in reality the differences are negligible during daily use and daily life. The third solution is probably the best, and this is a captive bezel, as is seen most notably on Zinn watches, where a set of screws are put into the side of the bezel which lock the bezel in place. So if you were to remove these screws it would pop up out of position, but by holding the bezel in place and doing up these screws it locks the bezel. Now, tightening and undoing these screws does not affect how tightly the bezel turns, but just affects how tightly it's actually attached to the case, which is why it's never advisable to undo these things yourself, because it can result in some serious problems down the line. But once the bezel is attached to the case or affixed in position, the next most important thing is setting it in order to be able to time periods of time or intervals with it. And the most basic solution, indeed the most traditional solution, is simply a friction bezel. This functions simply by, as implied by the name, the friction between the bezel which would rotate and the case. Now this can be metal-on-metal friction, or it can be metal against an O-ring or another rubberized surface of that sort in order to increase the friction and reduce the free turning. Now, With these sorts of bezels, over time they do tend to loosen up, which is why not that many watches still use friction bezels. One sees these things on, for example, Zin 103s. You can get those with friction bezels as a more traditional solution, and they're most commonly seen on pilots' watches rather than dive watches because of the fact that they can be knocked and moved relatively easily, which really, when your life depends upon a bezel, is not what you want, understandably. The next sort of solution to bezels, and the most common, is the clicking bezel. And I'll come back to these after I've spoken about one other, which is the button depressed bezel. Now, these are relatively rare. One sees them on watches like, for example, the Omega Seamaster 600 or the Ploprof, where a button is pressed in the side of the case, thus releasing the bezel. And if that's not, the button isn't depressed, then the bezel is simply locked into position. These are usually bidirectional rather than being unidirectional, as a dive watch bezel would normally be. And these are an extremely secure way of building a watch, but require quite a lot of additional heft to the case in most situations to accommodate the assembly in order to make these function. But to address the type of bezel which the vast majority of us have, there is of course the clicking mechanism, and this is a brilliant design. Whether you have a bidirectional bezel, like on a GMT watch for instance, or a pilot's watch, or you have a unidirectional bezel, as you would see on a dive watch, usually one comes across 60 click or 120 click. Admittedly, on some GMT watches, which are more specialised, they do make the effort of making them 24-click bezels, so that they can simply show you individual hours based upon the movement of the GMT hand. Of course, this does become a bit complicated if you're going between time zones where there's, for example, a 30-minute gap, but anyway, those tend to foil GMT watches anyway. But by and large, they have those 24-click bezels. But the weirdest bezel I've ever seen was a 90-click bezel, which didn't really work, it must be said, because of the intervals not really matching between minutes. But anyway, most of these use a spring in order to operate. The most basic solution is to have a flat steel ring, which has between one and the most I've seen was three little tabs of metal which are pushed out of them, which engage with little teeth on the underside of the bezel, thus allowing you to turn the bezel in a single direction in order to set the time, as on a dive watch. You do also see these where there's a kink in the top of those tabs which protrude in order to allow the bezel to move back and forth, but still with the same clicking action. And these are commonly seen on watches such as Seiko. I know that Seiko use them all the way into their high-end watches because it's a simple and elegant solution, but one sees these on watches as modest as a Seiko SKX. And these little tabs attached to those rings are anchored in place by little teeth or little feet which stick into slots cut into the case. It's a very simple solution, but from my experience, I've had a few watches, in fact, which have suffered problems with these. Two Seikos of mine have had these tabs snap off because with metal fatigue over time, they do tend to snap off, which is an annoyance because it tends to be less than the service interval if you use the bezel on a very regular basis. Of course, I can't talk for all bezels of this nature, but this has happened to quite a few watches I've had, and that's the one observation I'll make. You do then have what Omega notably uses and also what Zin uses, which is where a slot is drilled into the case into which a standard coiled spring is put, and this is a cylindrical slot in the case, into which a cylindrical spring is slotted, and onto the top of that spring either a ball bearing is placed or a little toothed piece, and this slots into the bottom of the bezel, and because of the shape of that spring, when you rotate the bezel and those teeth move over the ball bearing on the top of the spring, it's pushed into the case, creating that clicking sound and locking the bezel in place. And you see this on, for example, Omega Seamasters. It's a very elegant solution. Also, it avoids that metal fatigue problem which you might get from the tab solution to these springs. The third most common solution is the way Rolex produce their bezels, and I've seen this used by some homages to Rolexes, but I haven't, I must admit, seen this bezel design, or this bezel mechanism design, on watches from other brands. And this is a setup which sort of balances the pros of both of those other manners of producing a bezel assembly. It uses a metallic spring in the same way as those pressed springs on the Seiko, but also has a more robust setup, which follows in the sort of footsteps, if you will, of the coiled spring approach as I described in Omegas. And this is composed of a small lowercase L-shaped tab of metal, which protrudes horizontally, curved outwards from the side of the case. So the one end of this little tab engages with teeth on the outer rim of the inside of the bezel sitting on top, and the other end of this little lowercase l is turned down and slots into a little drill hole in the case, and so is able to pivot on that drill hole outwards and inwards depending upon whether the bezel is in motion or locked in position. This spring actually then acts with force against the case and the bezel, so you get that pleasant click which you get with all of these spring arrangements, and is then held down so as to not fall out by a metal washer which goes around the full circumference of the bezel and holds it in place. It's a very simple, very elegant solution, but I must admit I've never heard of one of these failing, which I think says a lot for the advantages of a simple but very robust solution to these to the matter of making a bezel click like this. But now we come to the actual bezel material, and the material of a bezel is often described in reviews and other publications and videos, but I'd like to go into it in a slightly more comparative way to give an idea of what different materials have as far as advantages are concerned. And the most basic and standard material for a bezel insert is aluminium, and you see these on a whole range of watches today and even more commonly in the past, because through really the 60s until the early 2000s it was the most practical solution to a bezel insert. You could have it coloured through various coatings including anodization, and because it was cheaply replaced, it was a good idea to have that on the front of the watch where the face of the watch would come into contact with the most abrasion and bumps, so you could have that replaced quite easily. Now you see this on a variety of different dive watches, because the beauty of an aluminium bezel insert is that because it's surface coated, it tends to be more resilient than the 2.5 to 3 Mohs hardness which you would expect from aluminium would suggest. Now the other benefit is that it tends to be non-reflective because it has a matte surface when it's anodized or coloured. But also if you do dent it, you won't lose the bezel, you'll just damage the small spot which you've knocked. So it's incredibly useful for things like diving, because it remains functional even when damaged. A material which preceded aluminium as a bezel insert material was Bakelite. And Bakelite is essentially an antiquated form of plastic, which is seen on a variety of applications if you look at vintage objects, whether that's radios, even car steering wheels had Bakelite coatings, or fixtures made of this material, and it's very brittle. You do sometimes see it on modern watches where they've used a vintage bezel, but largely these were phased out by the 70s because they weren't particularly practical. They were easily cracked, but give a very warm look because they're clear in terms of allowing light through, so they're between transparent and translucent, which gives you this three-dimensional look, which can look rather lovely, but they tend to be soft and brittle. The modern alternative to this is acrylic, which is a bit less brittle than Bakelite, but gives the similar sort of warm look because of a similar optical effect in essence. And it gives this attractive appearance, but isn't very scratch resistant because it is simply plastic. So that's something to be aware of with an acrylic insert, although you can polish scratches out quite easily with some form of abrasive. Polywatch would make sense as a liquid which you're able to apply to the surface and use with a cloth as an abrasive to remove the top layer of the bezel. Sharing the same sort of see-through appearance as acrylic or Bakelite, we have sapphire. And sapphire is usually fitted into a bezel with a coloured ring beneath it, so one doesn't tend to colour the sapphire itself, but the backdrop, which you'll see through the sapphire coating. Of course, some brands have coloured their sapphire, such as MB&F, although I must say, considering they made their sapphire red, I do wonder whether you would simply call that ruby, because they are chemically the same, apart from the impurity which gives the colour. So I'd be curious if any chemists in the comments down below could help me with that. But this gives a much higher hardness than acrylic or Bakelite, so it's more likely to shatter if you give it a direct blow than acrylic, but will require a lot more force to damage in any way, with a hardness of 9 on the Mohs scale, so aside from tungsten carbide in some cases, or diamond, you wouldn't be able to scratch it, which is really perfect for a bezel. But it doesn't give you quite the variety which some more modern materials would give in terms of etchings into its surface or finishes. But it's still a fantastic material, and you can get quite exotic shapes with it, such as seen on the Blancpain 50 Fathoms, where they have a domed shape to the sapphire bezel insert, which looks rather lovely. Perhaps the most versatile material for a bezel insert is ceramic, and usually this is zirconia, so zirconium dioxide, as a material which gives a hardness, depending upon the treatment, of between 6.5 and 8 on the Mohs scale, but usually on the top end of that, around 8. And so it isn't scratched by steel, and there are very, very few things which you'll come across during daily life which actually will wear away at this. Certainly particles in the air won't do so, unlike steel, for example, which over time can lose its finish if in a very dusty environment. Now, I don't mean dust as in household dust, I mean abrasive particulates in the air. And this tends to be a bit more brittle than a metal insert, but I must say I've never come across someone actually managing to shatter a ceramic bezel insert. So I think it's a fantastic balance of resilience and deals with daily assault, you could say, from different bumps, scratches, and knocks extremely well. It can also be treated very widely with different finishes, whether you have laser etched numerals, as you see on some Seamasters, and with just the surface etched, or you have some sort of laser engraving, as you see on, for example, a Rolex Submariner, where there's a very deep cut into the bezel which is then coloured, or you have liquid metal technology, which is used across the Swatch Group now, where metal is pressed into the gaps cut into this insert, which gives a very long-lasting appearance. The final material to really speak about is steel, because steel is in many ways the most versatile because of the sheer number of treatments available in order to finish steel in a variety of different ways. Now, bare steel is seen on a number of bezels, whether polished, like on a Breguet Type 20, or brushed, which is also something which one sees relatively often, like on the Tudor Black Bay with the steel bezel insert. And in terms of scratch resistance, this tends to show scratches more obviously than aluminium, but does tend to resist long-term wear more effectively, as a result of having a higher hardness of 5 to 5.5 Mohs, so a bump to the surface of the bezel is less likely to do significant damage, but fine hairline scratches will be more conspicuous, which is a bit of a pro and a con in terms of depending upon what you want out of a bezel. Of course, it does have a reflective side which you don't get with aluminium, which again is very dependent upon what you want out of a bezel, whether you want the lustre of steel or the functionality of aluminium. And in terms of a canvas to add surface treatments to, steel is superb also. We've seen from Seiko their lacquering process, where the surface of the bezel is painted in essence to give an incredibly glossy surface, but one which is very prone to scratches. But the most common coating one sees is a PVD or DLC treatment. And now with modern DLC treatments, one sees a much more abrasion-resistant surface than most others. One sees usually a surface hardness of 4,500 Vickers on the best of these bezel inserts, and some have achieved even higher resistances, which is extremely impressive and does mean the steel is incredibly well protected. Now, you can in some instances chip this surface off, which is an annoyance, but I've seen this so rarely, and modern coatings become better with every generation. I think this is going to become a much more popular solution. Certainly there has been an interesting approach to this with NTH watches, where the brushed steel bezel insert has been given a DLC treatment to colour them black, which seems to be extremely resilient and very cost effective too. One common misconception with these coatings is that they're simple surface treatments. Whilst they do only apply to the surface of the material, certain treatments of this nature actually leach into the surface of the steel, thus giving a slightly different resilience. And this is something which is very modern with these treatments, because it does result in less flaking, as was seen on some of the very early treatments of this nature, such as black cases, not so much bezels it must be said, but cases produced in the mid to late 20th century. But with that, I would like to conclude this podcast, as I think I've covered all of the most prevalent and major technical aspects which you might come across where bezels are concerned, and I hope this will be of help to people who are trying to choose between different options, or just understand what's going on within the bezel of a watch more clearly, because this is something which is very rarely included on the specifications list, especially the particular properties of the material used, or the means in which the interior of a bezel works, where the mechanism is concerned. So do leave your comments about the contents of this podcast, and also any questions you might have, as well as any requests you have for next week's episode, as I'm very open to requests as to the subject to talk about, or any sort of questions you might have, which I think adds to the community aspect of this podcast, as something which we can share as a useful medium for sharing information, and not simply a sort of a pre-planned lecture. And if you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, do remember to like, share and subscribe to hear more in future, or if you're listening to this on SoundCloud, follow us there too, to always be up to date with further episodes. So thank you very much for listening. This is Armand from WatchChronicler.com. Out.